Hello, welcome to our new show, Books and Novels of the Middle East. My name is Bill Jacobs and my co-host is Peg Maniatis. Peg is from the Silversides Museum. I am a former instructor here at Muskegon Community College. I'm retired, and we are brought to you today through the courtesy of the MCC filming crew. Today we're going to talk about this book, which is called I Am Nujood, I'm 10 Years Old and Divorced. This is a book about a young girl in Yemen who is 10 years old and divorced, huh?
The biggest thing that jumped out at me is that she had no real knowledge of the outside world other than what she saw on a few sporadic television programs, and their society is so closed that the only thing she knew was her own little community. Yeah. And in contradiction to our own society, where young children today are exposed to absolutely everything, you kind of go back and think, well, it's somewhat of an idyllic society because she's not facing all of the different predators we worry about in America, only to find out that there's a whole different group of predators out there for her.
In this society in Yemen, it is of course a Islamic society in which women and children are basically invisible or are supposed to be invisible. Women are the essential chattels of their husbands, and children even more so. So it's surprising that this young girl got the idea somewhere, and it's not clear in the book where, she got the idea to divorce her husband. She was married at the age of 9 by her father, who basically sold her off to a suitor because of debt. Mm-hmm. This is quite common in Yemen, of children 9, 10, and right in that age, to be married off without their knowledge and of course without their consent. So it's astounding that she gets the idea that she can actually divorce her husband.
The idea actually comes from her father's second wife, who, because of the trouble in the family village that we learn of later on in her story, that they have to move to the city. Mm-hmm. And the husband's second wife lives even a harder existence than the first wife, and the family is in utter poverty to begin with. Mm-hmm. And the second wife has a handicapped child from birth, and she knows the difficulty and she has feelings for Nujood, but she also says that, you know, this isn't right, and the only people that can help you would be the judge. Mm. And she's the only one that ever mentions this to her, and that just, Nujood takes that concept and runs with it the first chance, and I mean literally runs with it.
Yes, she ran right to the administrative courts.
To the administrative courts because someone told her. She was a bright enough girl that she could look outside of her own self. So many children at this age would have just gone into themselves, as she did many times. She describes how many times she hid in the corners of the new house that she was in.
Right.
And she couldn't even function. But when she talks to this trusted woman, this second mother to her, and this woman says one word, the child says, I have to do that. That's the only way I can survive.
Well, at that point, the family had moved from the village because they were shamed by this older girl who ran away or divorced her husband, something which is not quite brought out there.
The sister goes on a great deal towards the end, after she's opening up, and they understand the trouble was that the mother had gotten sick and she had gotten sent to the hospital. The oldest sister was at home, and someone supposedly came to the door and forced her to have intercourse. Mm-hmm. And therefore
which, by the way, is not unusual given what they say in this book. Again, women have no recourse. In Islamic law, which is the law of Yemen, it requires 4 witnesses to claim rape. So even though she was raped, she could never prove it.
She could never prove it. And the shame fell not upon the young man that caused it, it fell upon the young woman in her inability to prevent it. And that really, I looked at it and thought, well, that seems kind of backwards, because it's not really the victim's fault. It's truly someone else's idea that's doing this. And if she has no way of defending herself.
Well, that, of course, is a fundamental difference between the West and this society in Yemen. In this society, women are fully clothed, including their face, showing only their eyes. Although in the picture on the book, she's a little bit more than that. And the reason is because women are considered temptresses who cannot control their sexual urges. So the assumption is that she seduced him, that this isn't really rape. It's not the man's fault. It is the woman's fault, because that's what women do in this view of the world.
In this view of the world. And it's such a strange and different view than our own society. It led me back to the thought of, when did we start giving children rights, and to start thinking about when a child became precious as opposed to chattel or property or something. Because even in our own societies, children were sent out to work in the factories. Yes. At a very, very young age. Children were used on the farm at a very young age. It's not until much later that children are seen as gifts, as something to be cherished. And now you were saying, what year do you think that was, the progressive?
Well, it would be the 19-teens, during the progressive era. That's the first child labor laws, I think 1913 or something of that time in New York State is the first one, as a model for other states. And many states did not adopt it until even much later. Even as late as the Depression, we still see children working legitimately so, according to the law, in factories.
Do you see the rise of the suffragette movement to get women the right to vote as the time in our society when we started treating our children differently?
Yes, I think the two are fundamentally bound together. Not because of, women birth children and all that sort of thing, but because the two are the most vulnerable groups in our society. In any ethnic or economic group, women and children are the most vulnerable in our society. But I want to return to the idea of the fault of the male. It's very interesting to note, of course, in our country here in the United States, and in many Western countries, we have elaborate laws protecting women against rape and prosecuting those who violate them. But it's interesting to note that Islamic clerics from the Middle East continue to see Western women as half naked all the time. Whether they are or not, I mean, there's certainly, one could look at the Sports Illustrated issue, which is a sort of mainstream thing, and there are women who are not very well clothed, but that's okay. But that's the interesting difference. In the West, men are expected to control their sexual urges, unlike they are in the Middle East. And of course, they're blamable for that. And that's fundamentally different, because this society in Yemen is a society of the group, not of the individual. There are no individual rights. And that, of course, is one of the things that makes the story even more intriguing.
Yeah. That someone took the time to take the note of one young lady versus that of the entire society, because she's not the only one. This is not a rare occurrence.
Yeah.
And at one point, she recalls what the father said, and he, of course, is not talking about, finances or anything like that. He's talking about family honor.
Yes.
And that if he could have her married off and safe and secure, she could bring no dishonor to the family by having the problems that the older daughters had.
He even says at one point, honor is everything.
Honor is absolutely everything. And when you look back at the troubles in the town, he was more concerned about the family's reputation than about what happened to his children. And at one point, even the brother that has run away to Saudi Arabia finds out about how much dishonor has been brought to the family through his sisters. And there's not a moment of time saying, how are you? Are you okay? Is there anything that we can do to make you better? No, you've just brought dishonor to the family, and that is all there is to it.
Fundamentally different.
Fundamentally different.
From the West.
From the West.
Yeah.
And we have a hard time comprehending that. But I think, though, that in our society, we're just brought up so differently that we're brought up from day one to look at and to be fair and to think about others and to think about the needs of others. But in this society, it's completely different than that.
Yes, and of course, one of the other things about marriage in this society is that women and children can be beaten without any sort of punishment. There is no police that you call for domestic violence, as in this country. There is no concept of domestic violence in this society. So that, which again makes it striking that the judge actually sympathizes with her.
Yes.
And takes her into his house, which apparently is a very Western style house, right? They have television and games, and the children are running around and doing things that you would expect children to do in the West. So it's very strange that he exists in the society. Why do you think that is?
Because he's had the outside influences. And being a judge, he has probably left their area at some point, either through his education or through travel, and seen that what is in their society is not the only way. So many people in this society, this is the only way that they know of. There's no comparison. But when you leave and you see different things out in the rest of the world, you look back and then you question your own society. That whole concept of travel, bringing back new and different ideas in education, bring back different ideas. So therefore, the lack of education in this society deepens their resolve that they have to stay with what they know. If you expose people to new and different ideas, they're going to question the old ideas. And so therefore, then you must limit the amount of education. Look at the amount of education she and the other children in the area had. She knew enough at her age to write her name.
Yeah, she got the chance to do that.
Chance to do that, a skill that we expect out of most preschoolers in our society.
Yeah.
And she was just starting to learn to read. She couldn't even read the road signs at this point. And you think in our society, we expect the child by the time they're in kindergarten to at least be able to write their own name, to read the road signs, to pick up on the advertising signs and things like that. And here's a society where illiteracy is so high, but because it's so high, then they don't know that there's anything else out there in the rest of the world.
Yes, and there's a couple of things there. One, I think one of the reasons why the judge has these Western influences, I agree with you, it's probably because he's traveled, but it's never mentioned. Is he a judge in Islamic law, or is this some sort of Westernized concept that he's institution that he's in? I suspect it's Islamic law. So it's startling that he's not denounced in Yemen by the local clerics who would have said, no, you have to decide law according to the Quran, not according to Western standards. So I think one of the reasons why the judge is able to come to Western ideas is because of travel, but I think behind that is the imagination to be able to do that. And Yemen is unique there because of its geographic position for a millennia at least, being a crossroads of trade and currents from both the West and the East, and coming down from Saudi Arabia. So Yemen is a splintered society in some respects. So that makes it possible for the incursion of Western ideas.
And it's not just, the concept of Western ideas, it's multiple ideas from multiple countries. As being a country that has been the crossroads and having a major port where so many vessels come in, so many vessels go out, they bring goods, they bring services, they bring ideas, they bring language, where that's available to those people that are closer to the ports. But once you get away from the major cities, life has been for generations.
As in her village. You mentioned the idea of the lack of education. And I think you're absolutely right. Education breeds questioning and doubt and change. And those are important things to happen to people. But if you look at Yemen, people here for at least 1,000 years have been doing what they're doing every day. There's no change. They don't live in time, they live outside of time. What would happen to those people if you said, all right, we're not going to have Islamic law, and I'm not arguing in favor of it, I'm just saying, what happened if that was not there and we replaced it with Western law?
Well, whatever happens, whenever a vacuum occurs and where the traditional laws and what everyone understands is taken away, unless it's replaced immediately with something that is comparable as what they had and that everyone understands, problems arise. Exactly. Because people do not understand, and anytime a vacuum is there, something will fill that vacuum. And unless it's predetermined what will fill that vacuum, it's not going to work. Because oftentimes it then falls down to who is the strongest militarily to fill that vacuum.
Yes.
Not necessarily, the ideology is there, but unfortunately guns are stronger than ideology.
Yes, and institutions require money. They require people who believe in those institutions and people to enforce the regulations of those institutions. In other words, you'd have to take the society of Yemen, so to speak, lift it out, put it over here, and introduce an entirely new one that, as you point out, must be effective or it will fail.
It fails.
You cannot have gradual change in this way because Yemen society, and I suspect Islamic society at large, is based on absolutes. You cannot negotiate absolutes. You can only get rid of them. Right. You either do have them or you don't. There's no in between. You cannot have, which again makes that judge, in my mind, so unusual.
Very unusual. And the entire court system, so very unusual. To me, not having the broadest knowledge of Yemen society, that they seem like an anomaly. They seem like this is the law of the land. But unless you're in front of a judge, laws are still taken care of in their home villages, right, by their home courts, by family law dictating these things. And therefore then there's almost like two societies going on at the same time. There's the legal society, the governmental society, and the government says this, but until you get the backing of the communities, it's not going to be a complete change. And that almost seems to be a slower process of educating, and I'm not talking about books and knowledge, but just the ideals of something different, and that's a very slow change.
Because people must develop trust in those ideals.
They must develop trust in those ideals, and they're so different that if you have 1,000 years of a woman not being anything but the property of someone else, it can't change overnight. It has to slowly change in order for it to become part of the society.
Well, one thing that sort of seals the fate of the society is poverty, an incredibly grinding poverty. We're not just talking about not having this or that, but days and days where one does not eat because it has no money. And how can you have, so to speak, ideals or Western ideals in that society? You know, how do you do that?
You know, constantly throughout education, we're talking about before a child can prosper in an educational system, their basic daily needs must be met.
Right. So in this country we have breakfast programs, lunch programs.
And where in this society it's something completely different. And people are going to cling to what they know when they're too busy just functioning just to make it through to another day. Right. And they're not going to have the time, they're not going to have the desire, they're not going to have the ability just to sit back and be philosophers about it and think about something different, when the only thing I can think of is my family going to have a roof over their head tonight? Is there going to be something in that pot? Is my child's health being taken care of? Am I still having decent standing in the community? Those things are so much more important to them on their day-to-day basis. There's not even a thought as to the extras of the world.
And so the idea of honor and shame becomes very powerful.
Very powerful.
To the poor, because it gives them a sense of esteem. It's esteem that's grabbed from the outside and brought in. It doesn't come from the inside out as it would in the West. It comes in. And so poverty and ignorance are extremely important to this society, politically, socially, morally, I guess, in a certain sense. That trying to introduce ideas alien to that would probably be catastrophic.
It would be very difficult. And I was even surprised that when she got to the city, that there was a school.
Yes.
And that young women were being educated. So to me at this point, when this book was written, and she was going through all of this, that there was an attempt at change in their society, and that there is a slow integration of new and different ideas. It would not happen in 5 minutes or even 5 years. But over the course of, say, a generation, there could be great strides. But then again, there might be a lot of backlash too, because this is the way it's been done traditionally, and changing will be very difficult.
And very much she's represented by a woman lawyer in an extremely odd thing in this society. Surprised that that woman wasn't attacked and killed in reality.
Yes.
Under these circumstances. So the splinters in Yemen are very strong there between tradition and change.
And the tradition and the change, the women at the newspapers that were interviewing her had set up their own informal daycare so that they could meet every need that they needed to, that they could still raise their children by still having their intellectual abilities into running the newspaper. And they created their own room just to bring their children into work so that they would not be failing.
A sub-society.
A sub-society, yeah.
Is what happens in there. Yeah, an enclave of protection. And again, it's very interesting that you have a whole room full of women journalists who are educated, who've gone to the university, who know the standards of justice and truth, and are interested in enforcing those. Again, that's startling in this society of repression and poverty that is here. One of the things that's most interesting to me is that she chose to remain. That Nujood at the end says, I'm going to stay here in Yemen and work for change. Did that strike you as odd?
No, not at all, because there's two ways of looking at something. You can make what you have better, or you can take care of yourself. And I think because so many people gave her so many things, and they gave her the strength, that she realized that change was possible. By leaving, the only person that she would change was herself. But by staying, she was an example to so many. And so it was a selfless act, because easily any country around the world would have taken this young woman. And she would have fit in because she was open to fitting in these countries. But she chose, because of her moral upbringing, that it was her duty to give back.
And this is a 10-year-old girl.
This is a 10-year-old girl.
Yeah, startling for anyone of that age. My reaction to Nujood was, if I were her, I would get out. The heck with Yemen. It's not going to change, and I'm not going to change it, so I'm risking my life by staying here. It would be interesting to follow her to find out if she actually lives to get to the university, because that's a very real possibility of assassination of what traditional society considers heretics and apostates, for whom the penalty in Islamic law is death.
Very much so.
So.
And it's just, when you look at her, and we also have to forget, she's 10.
Yes.
When you're 10 years old, you're not thinking about much more than your family and your community and what's close to you. You don't understand the possibilities that are out there. She understood that her family was very important to her. Even though they weren't perfect, they weren't correct in so many things, it's still the family structure was what really grounded her. And in all of her difficult times, the one thing she wanted was to go home.
Yes, and it's striking also, again, that neither the older brother nor the father retained the power to discipline her, which ultimately could have meant death in the society. And I found that, again, odd. Why is it that the father doesn't Not that I wanted him to, don't misunderstand, it's just that given the logic of the
Tradition would have
society,
dictated.
yeah, that he kill her, really.
And truthfully, it ends up being the power of the press in this regard. That if the press hadn't picked up on this story and made it a national and an international issue,
Yes.
then who knows what would have happened. But because it suddenly became outside of their world, and that there was going to be repercussions from outside, that it changed everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a flock of international journalists who are coming to interview this young girl, and her brother is upset by that, in part
Well, it's changed his
envious.
society, because in his society and everything that he's been brought up since he was a young boy is the man is the important one. Women are subservient, women are secondary, and suddenly she's getting all the credit and the fame. And in the different societies around the world, women are treated differently. And it's such a novel idea, it's so different, that it really would be hard to get our heads around it. And I think about, take a comparison in our own society. If you have someone in a family that suddenly rockets to stardom, say like in Hollywood or something, how difficult it is for the siblings of that child to progress. And they really have to go out and find a different path so that they can feel that same self-worth.
Yeah.
His self-worth was already predetermined. Now it's not there. He's being usurped by a girl,
Yes.
which is very
Yeah.
difficult for him.
Again, to go back to the original part of the book, she's 9 years old and married. In this country, we would consider that severe sexual abuse,
Yes.
punishable by imprisonment and more, perhaps. Yet it is considered normal in Yemen society, and brought out in the book that, well, that's what the Prophet did. He married Aisha at 9 years of
old,
age.
and therefore then they all should be married at that, before they become the temptress.
Right. But interestingly enough, this whole thing reaches back a 1,000 or so years to the example of Muhammad, and says that's the way we're supposed to live our life, literally, not just metaphorically, as some people say in this country. Well, I would like to follow the example of Jesus or Gandhi or someone else, without the realization of what's behind that. But in this society, it's not there.
It's not there, and it's something completely different. And we'd really have to spend some more time discussing what it is in that society that dictates them want to go back. Well, we've just got a few minutes left in few seconds left in our time here. But we'll be continuing to discuss different topics and different novels and different nonfiction books throughout the course of the year.
Yes.
And we're going to take a long look at this society that is so different than our own, yet so important to our own society.
Yes, and we're going to be doing that on a regular basis at the Silversides Museum. We're going to be conducting a book discussion on the books that we will be discussing, and that list will be available to you
on the website. It's www.silversidesmuseum.org.
Thank you for watching, and we'll see you the next time.